I think the most difficult thing is, of course, that Louisiana and Texas are the root of so many of the emissions that are not just Louisiana and Texas's fault, if you will, right? We're not the consumers of all of the products that are a result of those emissions, right? So all the plastics companies, all of the ammonia and fertilizer. I mean, it really knocked my socks off to learn that one of the largest carbon emitters in the state is a fertilizer company that uses methane as a feedstock, and through their industrial processes have enormous carbon and methane emissions. And so it means that that sacrifice zone is exactly the problem, right? Because those fertilizers get made here, then they get shipped up the Mississippi to be spread on crops around the heartland. Those same chemicals go back into the Mississippi River, come back down the river, and wind up being what's called the dead zone every single summer, which is a result of all of those chemicals. And so it's this terrible connection where we just keep getting the fuzzy end of the lollipop.
You.
Hey, Jeannie.
Yeah, Bruce.
Who's our guest on the show today?
Today we have Logan Burke. Good morning, Logan.
Good morning to you. I'm coming to you from New Orleans. We are the Alliance for Affordable Energy, but we work all over the state of Louisiana. Our home is in New Orleans. We're all over the place here in the state.
And you've been around for decades, right? As an organization doing good work.
That's right. The Alliance has been around for 35 years. This is our 35th year. So we have seen a lot of energy changes over these 3.5 decades.
What are you going to tell us about today?
I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what it looks like to organize in a region. You might have heard of something called Gulf South for a Green New Deal. This is a regional network effort to work across state lines and really mobilize folks who are working in environmental issues, social justice issues, housing, water, you name it. But folks who've been working within their communities, typically small organizations, and we really intend to be led by folks of color and indigenous communities. And Gulf South for a Green New Deal is really not a coalition. Instead, it's a group of folks who are working together under a set of values and principles, and really, for the first time, organizing along one of the most vulnerable parts of our country to the impacts of climate change.
Do you have all 5 Gulf states involved?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we've got Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And having been a resident of 3 of those states and family in a 4th, the Gulf states are really important to me. We're not just working sort of in these little hubs, although each state has its specific priorities that they've decided amongst themselves. And then we're learning across state lines. You know, there are a lot of issues that cross these state lines, especially in the Gulf South, where big oil, big energy is a big deal. And we've got a lot of things that are kind of coming down the pike that we're all dealing with together. So, for example, the threat that carbon capture sequestration may present to the Gulf South. And I'm happy to share some maps with you about what that looks like. And so, you know, working together to learn not only about tactics and communications, but also, you know, what are some of these companies doing in other states? How can we learn about those kinds of tactics and strategies that we need to be prepared for? And so really working together on those kinds of things.
Can you just briefly describe the threat that carbon capture and sequestration presents?
Sure. To be clear, there is a very real need to deal with the carbon emissions that are already present in our atmosphere. And along the Gulf South, where there are lots of the nation's wetlands, we are already capturing in a natural biodynamic way some of those carbon emissions. But a lot of the corporations that have been part of the climate catastrophe that is upon us, your Exxons, your Chevrons, even your utilities are looking to invest in and use a mechanical version of carbon capture. Back in the day, you used to hear about it in terms of clean coal, basically to draw some of those carbon emissions out of processes or out of the atmosphere and pipeline them across state lines and then sequester them underground in a process that's not unlike fracking. In fact, some of carbon capture sequestration is called enhanced oil recovery, where they take that captured carbon and force it into the ground to force even more oil and natural gas out of the ground. And the reason that presents a tremendous danger to the folks in this region is, one, we are home to a lot of those large industrial companies that have been part of the carbon crisis, but also our geography suggests that there are places to sequester that carbon, whether in things like salt domes, which is a part of our very fragile wetlands and coastal area, also in terms of spent or mostly spent oil fields, which is where this enhanced oil recovery carbon would go. That lives in lots of Texas and Louisiana and even parts of Mississippi. And so we kind of have a target on our back for a lot of these reasons. And then one other one that's really concerning is the messaging from a lot of these oil and gas companies and their industrial associations that Southern communities are used to pipelines, that we're culturally fine with it, when nothing could be further from the truth for those communities that have been targeted by those very industries over the last number of decades. We know, for example, in Mississippi, last year there was an explosion of one of these pipelines, and it caused some real health concerns. The quotes in the local newspapers were, people were acting like zombies. Basically, carbon dioxide is not good for the atmosphere, and it's not good for people either. And so this presents a real danger for us.
So the companies that brought you Kemper are here to help some more.
You've got that right. Kemper, of course, is the coal plant that was supposed to be a clean coal plant and capture a lot of that carbon and sequester it underground. And after billions of dollars of extra spending, they decided, well, it doesn't work. We'll just burn natural gas instead. And so, I shared with you a breakdown of where people in Louisiana are working right now and how that connects with this conversation about Gulf South for a Green New Deal and carbon capture sequestration, is that this idea that we should move away from combusting things and we should move away from industries that pollute communities, the argument against it in so many circles is, well, what about the jobs? Well, the fact is, those jobs in the oil and gas, in the mining sector, have been, shall we say, falling off a cliff for quite some time now. And not only that, the jobs in those industries and the portion of our GDP, for example, in Louisiana, is nowhere near what it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so those messages are really now a myth. And so unfortunately now, when we look at and when we're hearing about the promise of carbon capture sequestration or storage, if you will, we're being told by the very same people who are saying, oh no, if we step away from oil and gas and from plastics and these toxic industries, then we won't have an industry at all. Now they're saying, but if we can capture all that carbon and you can pay us to pipeline it across your state and stick it in the ground, well, then there'll be a lot of new jobs. And unfortunately, there's no good reason to believe that that's true. We've not seen any studies about what the actual job numbers would be, not to mention the fact that it's an incredible cost to our communities. And so watching kind of the myth of the economy and the myth of having solid, stable jobs, and really thinking about and looking at what's happening in the rest of the country with the development of renewables jobs, energy efficiency jobs, and frankly, even here, jobs to preserve our coastline, that's where the future is. And so that's when we're talking about a Gulf South for a Green New Deal, what communities are really asking for.
So investing a lot of resources in polluting, wildly expensive things that make no sense for the long term isn't really a good long-term strategy for the economy, jobs, or anything else, and doing things that are less expensive, but create good, clean jobs and make sense and are going to be around for decades, it would be a better path.
It seems like the right way to go. And I'll tell you, the thing that feels so crazy to me is the governor of Louisiana last year created a climate initiatives task force. And the task force's job is to look at our emissions and figure out how to significantly reduce those emissions to, quote, net zero by 2050, and on a pretty fast trajectory. And Louisiana has a lot of industrial emissions. In fact, unlike most states, the industrial sector is our largest portion of emissions. Something like 2/3 of the emissions in our state are coming from industrial sectors. And so we've got a lot of work to do. Now, the first rule of holes is when you want to get out, you have to stop digging. And what we keep hearing is, well, we'll just solve it with this technology that we think will work. And it'll work in time to capture the tens of millions per year of carbon emissions that Louisiana's industries are emitting. And unfortunately, the conversation about actually turning off the tap on those emissions, which to your point is the cheapest, fastest, ready to go technologies, these are things that we know are working in other places and have to work here. And so it's been a real struggle to get even the governor to acknowledge that we really have to stop digging first. We really have to stop and deal with the emissions from the supply side, if you will, on the front end.
Yeah, there's a lot of inertia in the system, a lot of sunk costs, a lot of closed minds.
Yeah, they say that it's hard to turn around a big ship, and I think we saw that earlier this year in the in a canal. But yeah, these are big ships that have been around for about 100 years in Louisiana and along the Gulf South. But as I like to remind folks, it's only been 100 years. It's only been about 150 years that we've really done this amount of damage and that we've built up these industries. In the span of this planet and humanity, that's a blip. And that means that we have the opportunity to stop and look around and realize, all right, what are the things we really need and what are the things we don't? And how can we preserve the ways of life that mean so much to the communities in Louisiana, in Mississippi, and Alabama, and Florida, and Texas, as well as, of course, the rest of the country. I talk a lot about the Gulf South because we've been sort of on the front lines, the canary on the coastline, if you will, of climate change. It's been so obvious for well over a decade and a half, that our loss of coastline makes us more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's this feedback loop, right? The oil and gas industry cutting away at our wetlands, the continued burning of fossil fuels that are growing the rise of our sea levels and supercharging these storms. New Orleans last year was in the cone of uncertainty for 7 named storms. The coast of Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, absorbed something like $2 billion worth of just costs to rebuild our electric system in 1 year. Then we look at even the cold snap. Louisiana didn't get nearly the kind of impacts that Texas did, largely because, unlike Texas, we are part of a larger utility grid that goes all the way up and down the middle of the country and even into Canada. But we did experience some of the very same impacts. Our natural gas infrastructure broke down. Those generators weren't working. The natural gas pipelines had too much demand and in some cases froze up because of the high water content of our natural gas, blah, blah, blah. But also because our sort of demand side infrastructure, that is our housing, our buildings, are so inefficient, there was a huge demand for power and gas. And so there's a real need to tackle this from a people perspective. Before we start weatherizing power plants, the people of the Gulf Coast know that we need to weatherize our homes, because those are things that are going to impact us whether there's an outage or not, and not just in the depths of winter and the heights of summer. Those are those things that keep us safe and healthy before, during, and after a storm. And so when we're seeing these billions of dollars of impacts hitting our coastline year after year, we know we can't afford to not turn off the tap of carbon and other emissions.
And retrofitting, modernizing, weatherizing homes is wildly cost effective as well.
Yeah. In fact, the Alliance for Affordable Energy has been singing this song for near on 3.5 decades. The first best thing you can do to change Louisiana is to change a light bulb. That's what we used to say. Nowadays, it's to change out your HVAC system to a heat pump, or to make sure that your home is properly simply sealed, to make sure you're not losing all of that hot and cold air that you're heating and cooling throughout the year. It's really very simple. And unfortunately, a lot of these Gulf states have been captured, or at least their regulatory bodies have been captured by the utilities and the companies that stand to gain by selling just frankly too much energy to people that we're all burdened to pay. We just keep saying, let's cut this off at the pass. Let's stop wasting energy. Let's stop wasting money, and let's stop wasting time.
Stop digging.
Stop digging that hole.
And it sounds like there is momentum building with the network of the Gulf states, and your work is just continuing to grow. There's more of a national spotlight on these issues. And it's thrilling to hear that your alliance is around and then the Gulf states are getting together, because I'm a Texas transplant up here in New England, and it's hard for 6 New England states to coordinate. I'm sure it's hard for Gulf states to coordinate, but it builds power. So you've got momentum. It seems to be moving in the right direction.
And the utilities and the pipelines are interstate.
That's exactly right. Entergy is working in Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. Southern Company is working in Alabama and Mississippi. And exactly your point, all of these other industries and entities are working across state lines. And so that's why we were inspired to say, we need to be working across state lines and strategizing in the very same way. And so that is the purpose of Gulf South for a Green New Deal.
Thanks, Logan. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. It was really fun.
Great talking with you.
Thanks.
Anytime.